It's time now for some political analysis. Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. Susan Page is the Washington bureau chief for USA Today. Ramesh Ponnuru is a senior editor for the National Review and a columnist at Bloomberg View. And Susan Glasser writes for The New Yorker and is a CNN global affairs analyst. Ramesh, Republicans were critical of President Trump's performance in Helsinki earlier this week. The story changed a few times over the course of this week. We've seen this back and forth before. Is the fallout going to be different this time? And does this compel any action from a Republican Congress?
I think we have seen this before several times. We have seen calls for action from Republicans that have not been answered. And I think that's going to be the case this time. Because fundamentally, as shocked and appalled as a lot of congressional Republicans were, and a lot of members of Trump's own administration were, by Helsinki, they also see the polling that shows that 80% of Republican voters think that Helsinki was a success, which is a sign of how
80%,
which is a sign of how strongly they are supporting President Trump and how much they resent and dislike criticism of him, especially criticism from Republicans. So I'm afraid that that is not going to change this time.
What gets you to 80% thinking it's a success when the administration, as you heard from Senator Graham, hasn't said what they actually talked about or what was achieved?
I think that a lot of Republicans have decided they like President Trump.
Period.
And yes, and then another group of Republicans, maybe they have some misgivings, but when he's being criticized so unfairly by other people, by Democrats, by the media, as they perceive it, they're going to rally to his defense.
Susan, do we have a sense of what was agreed to in this meeting? I mean, we know that the White House rejected at least one offer on Ukraine.
Well, look, I think there's a direct conflict between the accounts offered by the Russians and the very sparse to non-existent information offered by our own government about what, if anything, was agreed to. We just heard Senator Lindsey Graham, who has been, an on-again, off-again useful ally of President Trump on Capitol Hill, saying on the show that he has no idea what, if any, agreements were made. This is astonishing. We are 1 week out from this meeting. The Russians have said there were multiple agreements, and President Putin himself said this. His ambassador to Washington said there were useful, important agreements that were reached on everything from Syria to apparently there were discussions about Ukraine. We know that there was this private conversation about possibly handing over Americans in exchange for allowing Russians to, question or aid the Mueller investigation, which was not shot down immediately by President Trump. Again, astonishing but very incomplete reports. President Trump has not briefed his own government in the way that any other summit would have been handled. This is really an event without precedent in modern American foreign policy.
So, Jeffrey, I mean, if you follow what Ramesh is saying there, it sounds like the more that national security officials stand up and say they're concerned, that the president actually seems to be benefiting.
Well, two quick observations. The first is the truest thing Donald Trump may have ever said is that he has followers who, if he shot someone on Fifth Avenue, would stay with him. I think we're seeing that every day in many different ways. The second point is, unprecedented is the word that we keep having to come back to, right? We have a situation in which the intelligence chiefs of the United States and the defense chiefs of the United States don't know what the president said to the Russian president, don't know what the Russian president said back, and they don't trust the elected president of the United States to advance American interests in these kind of meetings. This is a bad movie in many ways. I mean, this is some paranoid thriller from the 1970s in which a week later it's the Russians who are defining what came out of this meeting. And the American government, it's the American government, has no idea what happened in this meeting between the President of the United States and the Russian president.
And Susan, how do you take the political filter off of this? Because it sounds like, as Senator Graham laid out, there's a constant conflating of issues. There's the intelligence threat, the national security concerns, and then there is the president's constant claim of a witch hunt, and that's where the public seems focused right now.
But, I think Ramesh is right that there's not a titanic change in how voters look at this, but I do think this is a week where things began to change. I think began to see a greater willingness on the part of Congress to push back a bit. You saw the Senate vote backing up NATO and opposing the idea of turning over Americans, allowing the Russians to question them. And you also saw just the fact that the Director of National Intelligence and the Director of the FBI were willing to do interviews at the Aspen conference was a sign of some pushback in the president's cabinet. I think this week, it's dangerous to say this, I think this was the most tumultuous week of the Trump presidency in some ways. And the other thing,
we're putting a timestamp on that.
Until next week.
Until next week. The other thing that I think is happening is that some of the consequences of the president's policy are coming home on Russia, on China, on North Korea. Things are not, the president has had a chance to implement his policies. He's not getting the reaction and the results that he wants. So I feel like things are accelerating in a way. I'm not entirely sure where that goes, but I don't think this week is like every other week we've had.
One interesting thing about the isolation of the president in his own party, in his own administration on this issue, is it does suggest that there's a limit to how much Putin is possibly getting from this. I think if you step back, you'd have to say that Russia has managed to trigger a kind of hardening of a bipartisan consensus against Russia. Now, of course, having a president who is not part of that consensus in some ways, that complicates the picture. But the fact is, Congress and much of the administration isn't where he is.
Okay, but listen, he may be a party of one when it comes to American politics, at least on Capitol Hill. But in many ways, Vladimir Putin has he doesn't view things purely the way that we often do through American domestic politics. He has already accomplished much of what he set out to do, first of all, by being accorded the status and recognition of a summit with apparently no conditions whatsoever on Russia to be welcomed back effectively into the community of world powers after remember, this started with the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. That is the first illegal annexation of territory in Europe since the end of World War II. There have been essentially, Donald Trump has now said, never mind, it's okay, we're welcoming you back. He said he wanted to invite him back into the G7. And so, number one, Putin, by merely having the summit, I think won a victory. Secondly, he has basically embarrassed and humiliated the president of the United States. Now, you could say, well, it was the president himself who did it. But this is something that has an incalculable goal. Now, the policy apparatus in the U.S., whether it's on Capitol Hill with sanctions or they just announced $200 million in additional arms for Ukraine, that seems to be the Defense Department bureaucracy's response to the summit. But the fact that that continues on, President Putin has always been very savvy in saying what really matters is the word of the President of the United States. And that predates Donald Trump, by the way.
Can I just make one quick point about how American foreign policy is made? It's made by the President of the United States. The President has a lot of authority to make this. So you can say there's a hardening of a bipartisan consensus around Russia. The President decides American foreign policy. And by the way, the other salient, keep coming back to this point, 80%. The Republicans are with him. He gets to make foreign policy, and so Putin is getting something out of this.
You did hear from the Justice Department this week, Susan, though, with Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein coming out and saying, we're going to alert people when they are the victims of foreign government targeting. You are seeing the bureaucracy or the infrastructure try to harden here, but is there a limit to what they can do?
Oh, yeah, there is a limit. There's only so much you can do when the president is running his administration and you're an administration official on some kind of different track. But you can do some things. And I think that the Deputy Attorney General was a signal of one thing, of not going through the White House. The White House, he did not indicate the White House would decide if Americans were going to be alerted to meddling in future elections. You saw that with Dan Coates and with Chris Wray, where you see some officials, I think, trying to stand up in a way we haven't seen before. But there are real limits what they can do because, as you say, the president is president. And particularly, this is why presidents love foreign policy when they get in trouble at home, because they have so much more sway there than they do on domestic affairs.
We had another report on Friday of past indiscretion of the president, allegedly, with this model and a recording of a conversation he supposedly had with his then attorney, Michael Cohen. Where do we frame this? Where do we put this in terms of some of these allegations of the president's past behavior?
I think the allegations about the president's personal behavior don't have much impact in our system anymore. I don't think people are surprised by them. I think the Russia allegations are much more serious to our constitutional system. The one way in which these could be serious is we don't know what else Michael Cohen knows and might be able to reveal and might have taped. Also, it could, of course, lead to criminal violations. There could be criminal cases coming out of this if it involved breaking of campaign finance laws.
The significance of having the President of the United States potentially caught on tape admitting to something in private that publicly they were denying, that hearing the voice of the President himself, if we ever hear this tape lying, would be something that, you know, has a potential impact regardless of what the underlying story was. So I do agree that it does seem to be, you know, baked into the cake at this moment in time. You know, people have these very, very fixed views. This is a very divisive time, and so it's hard to get people to change their opinion about Donald Trump. But I do think we shouldn't understate the potential shock value of hearing whatever the president said on this tape.
Of all the things that could disturb and destabilize Donald Trump this week, all of the criticism, the fact that his lawyer has now evidently turned against him and has tapes and is willing to turn them over, that is the thing that's probably depressing him most today.
Understand the president's comments about how upset he is with his chairman.
Well, the president expressed frustration because he thinks he's doing a lot to stimulate the economy, and the Federal Reserve, by raising interest rates, is acting against that. It's the kind of frustration a lot of presidents have had. Typically, though, when presidents have expressed that kind of frustration, they've prompted a reaction by the Fed, which wants to guard its independence, and sometimes will go more in the direction the president doesn't want them to go for that reason. I think what you have here is a president who doesn't quite understand the norm of leaving the Fed alone or the reasons why that norm developed in the first place.
And
that was an understatement. That was an understatement.
And any comment obviously has market implications. Thank you to all of you. We will be back in just